The origin of pizza is not the story you were told, and it took DNA to prove it. The most Italian dish on earth was built on a plant Italy didn't have, one that, at first, was feared as a poison. And how it reached your plate is stranger than the legend. I spent weeks cross-referencing the tomato's genome with Neapolitan archives and a document more than 1,000 years old, separating fact from marketing. And the next slice you eat is about to mean something completely different. Everyone knows pizza is ancient and unmistakably Italian, but the version you actually picture, red, saucy, Neapolitan, is barely older than America, and the truth was hiding in a genome the whole time. Ask anyone where pizza comes from, and you'll get the same scene. Naples, 1889. A master pizza maker named Raffaele Esposito lands the job of his life, cooking for a queen. It's a beautiful story. Esposito prepares 3 pizzas for Margherita of Savoy. She falls in love with one, tomato, mozzarella, and basil. Red, white, and green. The exact colors of the Italian flag. He names it in her honor, and from the palace comes a thank you letter that still hangs on the pizzeria wall today. It's the birth certificate of Italy's national dish. It's perfect, maybe too perfect. But that story starts in 1889, and the word pizza is almost 900 years older. To find it, you don't go to Naples, you go to Gatita, a coastal town in Lazio, 50 miles away. In the archive of its cathedral sits a document from the year 997. It's a contract, one of the first texts written in something close to Italian, and inside is a single word that changes everything. It's the lease of a mill beside the river Garigliano. A man named Bernardo, son of Duke Marino II, agrees to pay his bishop a tribute every year. He puts it in Latin, duodecim pizzae, 12 pizzas. 12 every Christmas and every Easter, along with a cut of pork and a pair of hens. Read that again. The first pizza in history wasn't served to a queen. It was owed to a bishop, and it looked nothing like what you're picturing. No tomato. The tomato was still 500 years away from crossing the ocean. That pizza was a flatbread. White, plain. The word itself gives it away. It comes from the Latin pincere, to pound, to press, to flatten. A pizza was, literally, flattened dough. No sauce, no melted cheese, no queen. So both halves of the myth collapse at once. Naples didn't invent the word. Margherita didn't christen the dish. Both ideas arrived centuries late to a story that was already written on a forgotten scrap of parchment. But this opens a much bigger problem, because the pizza you love is red, and that red comes from a fruit Europe didn't have in the year 997, or in 1200, or in 1400. If the word is 1,000 years old, but the ingredient that defines it is late, then the dish on your table can't be as old as its name, which means somewhere in those 500 years, something happened. Someone carried that red fruit across the world, and when it finally reached Europe, the last thing you'd expect happened. Nobody wanted to eat it. When the tomato reached Europe, it didn't arrive as food. It arrived as a suspect. The journey had started in an emperor's gardens. In 1519, Hernán Cortés walks into Tenochtitlan and finds something Europe doesn't have: plants heavy with red fruit, grown in the gardens of Moctezuma. The peoples of Mesoamerica had been eating them for centuries. By 1540, those fruits had crossed the Atlantic and landed in Seville. 4 years later, an Italian botanist, Pietro Andrea Mattioli, writes the first European description of the tomato. He doesn't call it a tomato, he calls it pomodoro, golden apple. Notice one detail. Mattioli describes it as a plant, not as a recipe, because for almost 2 centuries, no one in Europe dared to eat it. The tomato stayed in the botanical gardens as an exotic curiosity, pretty and dangerous. Why dangerous? Its family. The tomato belongs to the nightshades, the same family as belladonna and mandrake, plants that kill in small doses. It looked too much like its lethal cousins. So the suspicion was reasonable. If the family kills, so might the fruit. But suspicion turned into certainty for a reason that had nothing to do with the tomato. Europe's aristocrats ate off pewter plates. Pewter is an alloy with a high lead content, and the tomato is acidic. When that acidic juice touched the plate, it pulled the lead out and carried it straight into the food. The noble ate tomato, was poisoned by lead, and sometimes died. Nobody suspected the plate. Everyone blamed the fruit. And so the tomato earned a nickname that clung to it for more than 200 years, the poison apple. Here's the irony that changes everything. The poison only killed the rich. The poor didn't eat off pewter. They ate off wood and clay. With no lead to leach, for them the tomato was exactly what it looked like: cheap, juicy, and perfectly edible. While the aristocracy feared it, hunger pushed the poorest of Naples to try it, and nothing bad happened. Quite the opposite. At the end of the 17th century, someone in Naples did the most obvious and the most revolutionary thing at once. They took that same old flatbread, the pizza they'd known for centuries, and put the tomato on top. That gesture, made by people who had nothing, is the birth of the pizza you know. No queen invented it. Hunger did. So the real timeline is brutal. The word pizza is 1,000 years old. The flatbread, older still. But the red pizza, the real one, couldn't exist until an American fruit beat 2 centuries of fear at the tables of the poor. At the earliest, in the 18th century. And this is where someone jumps in. Wait, they'll say, the Romans already made pizza. In 2023, archaeologists in Pompeii uncovered a fresco almost 2,000 years old. In it, a flatbread with things on top. Headlines around the world called it the same thing, the ancestor of pizza. Look closer, and you'll see what's missing. No tomato. There can't be. In the Pompeii of the year 79, the first one was still nearly 1,500 years from crossing the ocean. What those Romans painted was something else. Fruit, spices, maybe a kind of pesto. A bread with toppings, yes. Pizza, no. And that leaves a loose thread. If the tomato is the red heart of all this, where exactly did that fruit come from? Because its true origin isn't where you think. It isn't in Moctezuma's garden. It's written in its DNA. And what that DNA reveals doesn't fit the story we just told. For centuries, the official story was simple. The tomato is Mexican. Cortez saw it in Moctezuma's gardens, and from there to the world. But when geneticists sequenced its DNA, they found something that story couldn't explain. The tomato was already a traveler long before it met a European. And its starting point wasn't Mexico. To see it, you have to find its wild ancestor. It's called Solanum pimpinellifolium, though the scientists who work with it call it, fondly, pimp. And it looks nothing like the tomato in your salad. Its fruit is barely 1 or 2 centimeters across, the size of a blueberry. It weighs a gram or 2. It's a weed that still grows wild in one very specific place, the coastal strip of Peru and southern Ecuador. The Andes. Think about that for a second. The ancestor of that plump red tomato crowning your pizza was a tiny berry growing alone in a South American desert. Nobody planted it. Nobody wanted it. How does a sour little berry become a 200-gram tomato? The same way you perfect a recipe. Over generations, always keeping the best. And the DNA shows that recipe was cooked in 2 steps, in 2 different places. The first step happened in the Andes. There, that wild weed slowly became a cherry-sized tomato. A little bigger, a little sweeter. Scientists call it a pre-domestication. The second step happened thousands of kilometers to the north. That cherry tomato traveled up to Mesoamerica, to present-day Mexico, and there human hands finished turning it into the large tomato we know. Andes first, Mexico after. Which means that when Cortez saw it in that garden, he was looking at the end of a very long process, not the beginning. The tomato had already spent thousands of years being shaped by American farmers, migrating from south to north, long before a Spanish ship carried it to the other side of the world. And that shaping came at a cost. Every time you pick the best seeds and discard the rest, you throw away genetic variety. Generation after generation, the tomato lost a huge part of the diversity its wild version still had. Biologists call it a bottleneck. We gained a big, juicy fruit, but by squeezing it through a funnel that left almost everything else behind. How big is that difference? Here's the number that seals it. In 2020, a team published in Nature Communications a comparison between the genome of that wild tomato, the accession called LA23, and a modern cultivar, Heinz 1706, the base of half the world's ketchup. They found more than 92,000 structural variants between the two. These aren't stray typos. A structural variant isn't changing a single letter, it's tearing out whole paragraphs, moving pages, rewriting entire chapters of the instruction book. 92,000 times. That's the distance between the desert weed and the tomato on your pizza. Now, it's worth being honest about what still isn't settled. Geneticists are still arguing over the details of that journey. Whether the Andean steppe was a full domestication or something blurrier. Whether there were crosses with wild populations along the way that tangled the family tree. The one thing they all agree on is that the process was complex. Many cultures, many migrations, many centuries. Not a straight line, but the headline holds. The red heart of Italian pizza is an American immigrant with an impossible resume, a wild berry from the Andes, redesigned in Mexico, feared in Europe, and finally adopted by the poorest of Naples. And those hungry Neapolitans were about to do something no one saw coming, because their food of misery didn't stay in Naples. It crossed an ocean. And this time, the tomato's journey was going to change the entire world. To understand how pizza reached your plate, you first have to understand how little it was worth. In the Naples of the 18th and 19th centuries, pizza wasn't a dish. It was fuel for people who had nothing. The city had swollen into one of the largest in Europe, and with it grew a mass of urban poor known as the Lazzaroni. They lived hand to mouth, hauling loads, running errands. They needed something cheap, hot, that could be eaten with one hand while they worked. Pizza was exactly that. It wasn't sold in elegant rooms, it was sold in the street. Vendors worked the alleys with huge boxes under their arms and cut you a piece to match whatever was in your pocket. A small piece if you had little. A big one on a good day. Folded, with your hands, standing up. And it worked. By 1807, the historian Antonio Mattozzi documented 54 registered pizzerias in Naples. By the end of the 19th century, around 120, pizza was feeding the city. But outside those alleys, no one respected it. In 1831, an American traveler tried Neapolitan pizza and described it with disgust. His name was Samuel Morse, the same man who would go on to invent the telegraph. That nauseating cake, he said, looked like bread taken reeking out of the sewer. He wasn't alone. When the first Neapolitan cookbooks appeared at the end of that century, they did something telling. They ignored pizza completely. Didn't even mention it. It was too poor, too dirty, too much of the street to earn a page. So by the early 20th century, we had a paradox. Pizza already existed just as you know it. Bread, tomato, sometimes cheese. But it was still locked inside a single city, looked down on by nearly everyone, Italy included. And then, hunger saved it again. But not in Naples. Between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, millions of Italians from the South, from the Mezzogiorno, fled poverty and boarded ships for the United States. They carried no money, no titles, but in their cultural baggage, without knowing it, they carried a recipe. Pizza crossed the Atlantic not as fine cuisine, but as the food of poor immigrants, packed into the Italian neighborhoods of American cities. In 1905, in New York's Little Italy, an immigrant named Gennaro Lombardi got a license. His place, Lombardi's, became the first documented pizzeria in the United States. What in Naples was food to be ashamed of, in New York began to take root. Now notice what still hadn't happened. At this point in the story, pizza was still a regional, humble dish in Italy, almost unknown beyond Naples. A Roman, a Milanese, a Florentine in 1910 had probably never tasted it. It wasn't Italy's national dish, it wasn't a symbol of anything. It was the food of one poor southern city that, on top of everything, half the country looked down on. So stop here and look at the full map. Real pizza lived in two places at once, and in neither was it yet Italian. In Naples, the food of the discarded. In New York, the nostalgia of immigrants. In the rest of Italy, it simply didn't exist. Which raises the most uncomfortable question in this whole documentary. If in 1910, pizza wasn't Italy's national dish, when did it become the very symbol of the country? Who turned the food of the Lazzaroni into an entire nation's edible flag? The answer is going to hurt Italian pride. Because the most Italian dish in the world didn't become famous in Italy. It became famous 3,000 miles away, and it came home as something else. On a wall in Pizzeria Brandy, in Naples, hangs a framed document. It's the letter in which the royal household thanked Raffaele Esposito for the pizza he made for Queen Margherita in 1889. It's the birth certificate of Italy's national dish. Millions of tourists have photographed it, and it's fake. In 2014, the historian Zachary Nowak published his analysis of that letter in the journal Food, Culture, and Society. He didn't throw out a wild accusation. He took it apart, piece by piece. First, the royal seal. It doesn't match the authentic court seals of the period. Second, it sits off-center, not in the top left, as the official standard required. Third, it isn't written on royal stationery, but on ordinary paper. And fourth, the handwriting doesn't match that of the Chamberlain Camillo Galli, the man who supposedly signed it. 4 flaws in the one document that holds up the entire legend. But the real blow is in what the letter says, and in what it doesn't. The original text, dated June 11, 1889, simply thanks him for pizzas that were excellent. Nothing more. No mention of tomato. No mention of mozzarella. No mention of basil. No mention of the Italian flag anywhere. All that lovely tricolor symbolism, the red, the white, the green of the homeland, was added later. It wasn't in the document. It was invented. And why would anyone stage a fraud like that? Here comes the detail that gives it all away. 6 years before that supposed royal visit, in 1883, Esposito had already renamed his shop something far from innocent, Pizzeria of the Queen of Italy. The marketing move wasn't an afternoon's whim. It had been running for years. A clever pizza maker building, brick by brick, the legend that would make him immortal. Let's be fair to the facts. That the letter is fake doesn't prove the Queen never tasted a pizza. It only proves that the single piece of evidence for the story is a fraud. And there's something even more uncomfortable. Pizza with tomato, mozzarella, and basil already existed in Naples before 1889. Nobody invented it for a queen. It was already there, in the street, in the hands of the poor. But if the founding myth is marketing, the big question remains. How did this food of misery become the symbol of all of Italy? And the answer is the final twist. It wasn't Italy that crowned pizza. It was the United States. Remember those Neapolitan immigrants? In America, their humble recipe grew into a national phenomenon. Then, in 1943 and 1944, Allied soldiers landed in Campania, tasted the real thing, and fell for it. They started asking for it all over Italy. And later, with post-war tourism, millions of foreigners arrived looking for authentic Italian pizza. The Italians, most of whom barely knew it outside Naples, gave it to them, and in doing so they adopted it as their own. Anthropologists have a name for this. They call it the pizza effect, something a country exports that transforms abroad and returns home as a symbol of national identity. The name isn't a coincidence. Pizza is the original example. The most Italian dish in the world became Italian in America, and it came home dressed up as a 1,000-year-old tradition. So the next time you're holding a slice, look at it for 1 second before that first bite. That red that defines it isn't Italian. It's a wild berry from the Andes, redesigned in Mexico, feared as poison for 2 centuries, and rescued from oblivion by the poorest of Naples. That bread folded under the sauce wasn't born for kings. It was born for people who ate standing up, with their hands, running between errands. And the story of the queen who blessed it, one framed on the wall, was written on ordinary paper by a man who'd spent 6 years preparing the lie. Pizza isn't a 1,000-year-old tradition that came down intact from antiquity. It's one of the greatest acts of reinvention in the history of food. A dish of the discarded that crossed an ocean, became a star in America, and came home disguised as national heritage. And here's what should keep you up at night. If you believed your whole life that pizza was ancient and Italian, and it turns out neither is quite true, what else on your table have you been told backwards? Because you didn't just watch the story of one strange dish. You watched the pattern, an invented origin, an ingredient that comes from somewhere you'd never guess, a national symbol, manufactured after the fact. The same move is hiding in almost everything you eat, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Think of another food you'd swear is ancient, one you also eat with your hands, wrapped. On the other side of that same ocean, the taco. Everyone believes it was handed down from the Aztecs, old as the pyramids. It wasn't. The taco is far younger than you think, and its name may not have been born in a kitchen at all, but somewhere far more explosive. That's the next thread we're going to pull. Tap the taco on your screen now and find out where it really comes from.